The first thing I want to do, of course, is acknowledge that many of us are coming to this virtual gathering from the traditional lands of the Anishinaabe, the Cree, the Oji Cree, and the Dakota Nations, as well as the homeland of the Métis Nation. We begin by acknowledging that because we believe that everything that we do as Protect Ed should be in right relation with the original peoples of this place, and that also that the treaties were negotiated in these territories made promises of education. And so by defending education, we are also honoring the treaties. Before we get going, we also want to acknowledge that the panel that we've assembled today is not particularly diverse with regards to race or ethnicity. You're going to hear a lot about Nova Scotia and the fight back against Bill 72 there. That, of course, included numerous members from the Mi'kmaq community as well as the African Nova Scotia community. And those perspectives are not directly participant or on our panel today. And so that is a shortcoming in what we've done for you today, and we acknowledge that. We will endeavor in the future to have panels which are more representative and more diverse. So our plan today is that we are going to quickly have 3 presentations from people who've directly experienced the education reforms in Nova Scotia. And then there'll be a question and answer period. Before we do that, though, we'll just kind of set a little bit of context. So this is the first of a summer teach-in series. We are going to be having these teach-ins every Tuesday throughout the whole month. So today our theme is, what are the attacks on public education in Canada, and what outcomes can we expect from Bill 64 and other kinds of reform? And so specifically, we're looking at the experiences of very similar education reforms in Nova Scotia. So thank you very much for joining us. This, of course, is brought to you by Protect Ed Manitoba. Protect Ed Manitoba is a nonpartisan, nonprofit collective of educators and community members who are dedicated to supporting equal and democratic education in Manitoba, public education in Manitoba, now and always. We've formed in order to push back on Bill 64 and other attacks on education beyond. So thanks very much for joining us. So the context of what's happening today is that we are trying to explain and understand what education reforms look like in other places, and specifically what we should be worried about here in Manitoba with Bill 64. So many people are aware of these similarities, but we wanted to spell them out very quickly before we launch into our panelists sharing their information. So in Manitoba, the education review was conducted by Avis Glaze. It started in it started in January 19, but the report was officially released in March of 2021, so just recently. As many people know, Avis Glaze also conducted the education review in Nova Scotia. It was announced in 2017, and the report was released in January 2018. So the principal writer of both education reviews was the same person. In Manitoba, of course, it's called Bill 64. It's the Education Modernization Act. It was announced in March 2021, so it's relatively new. And of course, it has not been passed yet. It is still proposed. In Nova Scotia, they had Bill 72, which was the Education Reform Act. And that act has come into effect and has been in effect since February of 2018. And so this is really kind of the crux of what this evening is trying to do, is to say what has already come down the pipe in Nova Scotia is what we can likely expect in Manitoba. So here are some of the ways in which they are similar. In Manitoba, they pushed for the elimination of school boards. In Nova Scotia, they also eliminated school boards, and that, of course, had impact on numerous communities. In particular, it eliminated the designated seats for Black and Indigenous representation. In Manitoba, they've proposed to create school community councils, which are going to represent the interests of parents, supposedly, and students. In Nova Scotia, they created school advisory councils. So again, very similar. In Manitoba, it proposes to remove principals and vice principals from the bargaining unit, which is an undemocratic move to basically strip 6 to 7% of the membership of the Manitoba Teachers Society from belonging to the bargaining unit. In Bill 72, it removed principals from the definition of a teacher. And then in both Manitoba and Nova Scotia, there was a proposal to create a college of teachers for disciplining teachers and regulating them. Of course, this has come into being in Manitoba, but it was proposed and then pushed back on and rejected in Nova Scotia. In Manitoba, one difference is that there was a dissolution of school divisions into regional districts. It's not our understanding that the school divisions were all actually dissolved in Nova Scotia. So with that kind of context out of the way, we are going to pass it over to the people who've actually lived through these reforms in Nova Scotia. And we will start with Paul Wozney. Paul Wozney is the president of the Nova Scotia's Teachers Union. Thank you very much for joining us, Paul.
Thanks, Patrick, and Protect Ed for the invitation tonight. I'm just going to attempt to share my screen here. I think this is it. So as Patrick indicated, Avis Glaze did conduct a review. I think it's worth pointing out that the Glaze report was supposed to evaluate school administration and governance. It wasn't a comprehensive review of the entire public education system. Avis Glaze her mandate was to evaluate school governance and administration. And ostensibly for the purpose of identifying and realizing greater efficiencies within the system that could, so resources could be reallocated after reorganization to better support public education. So I really want to talk about three principal impacts of Bill 72 since it was legislated in February of 2018. The first, Patrick has already referenced. Structurally in Nova Scotia, I do want to point out that there remains one elected school board in Nova Scotia. We have one francophone school board, the Conseil scolaire acadien provincial. It remains an elected school board legally, and the government didn't touch it because it has a mandate to preserve and promote the Acadian culture, which of course is a francophone culture. And they did not want to wade into charter territory and infringing on the linguistic rights of francophone Nova Scotians. So they left the francophone school board alone. All anglophone school boards, they eliminated elected boards of trustees. At the time, there were 7 anglophone school boards. They are now called regional centers for education because they were regional school boards. And legally speaking, they're referred to in the all the CSAP and these new Anglophone monoliths are called education entities. So if you want to talk about what we used to call school boards, you have to say education entity because Regional Center for Education only applies to Anglophone. So it's really made things very simple to have a conversation about education in Nova Scotia. But the elimination of elected trustees for Anglophone school boards came at a great cost, particularly to African Nova Scotians. Nova Scotia is home to the oldest and largest Indigenous Black population in Canada. African Nova Scotians have resided in this province for more than 100 years before Canada entered into Confederation. So we're talking 4 centuries of existence for the Black community here in Nova Scotia. And of course, they were subjected to slavery and then to legal segregation, and actually operated a separate school system strictly for Black children for a significant period of time before public education was what's the word I'm looking for? Was amalgamated, integrated. That's the word. Nonetheless, the Black community of Nova Scotia fought for generations for designated representation on elected school boards. The same was true of the Mi'kmaq people in Nova Scotia. There's one recognized Indigenous people, the Mi'kmaq. In terms of being Indigenous to the geography here, I should recognize that I'm presenting to you on the unceded ancestral territory of the Mi'kmaq people, Mi'kmaqi. So Nova Scotia is unique in the country in that we only have one recognized First Nation from one tip of the province to the other. So, and the other thing that I want to recognize is that in terms of gender equity, elected school boards were the one level of elected governance in Nova Scotia where we had better than gender parity representation for women. And a significant number of women who have gone on to careers in both the provincial legislature and federally really got they cut their teeth as elected trustees. Elected trustees obviously don't have the same intense workload as MLAs or MPs. So it's sort of a kinder, gentler, less workload intensive version of democracy. But nonetheless, it's a proving ground, and it's really equipped and empowered a significant number of women throughout Nova Scotia's history to engage in the wider democratic process. So these voices really had a home in elected school boards, and they have since been silenced, which is problematic because it's not like systemic anti-Black racism and truth and reconciliation have all been sewn up neatly. We don't have problems in Nova Scotia anymore. We absolutely do. The second thing I want to talk about is parent and teacher workload. I think one of the things that's often missed is elected trustees sometimes get a bad rap. People don't really understand what they do. But there is a tremendous amount of institutional knowledge that's resident within elected school board trustees. They have perhaps the most comprehensive understanding of the maze, and I'm being kind, when it comes to public education bureaucracy. So do you talk to somebody at the school board? Do you talk to somebody at the department? Do you talk to somebody here? Public school board trustees are really a parent's key resource when there is a policy or a system concern. And when they were turned out to pasture, all of a sudden, what they did was they hired these people called parent navigators. And none of these people had been elected trustees. So they hired a couple of people off the street and said, these people will help you figure out what your concerns are and where to take them. And arguably, those roles really have not had anywhere near the kind of impact that elected trustees did. And so what that does is, when angry parents have nowhere to go, they go where they know. And that's to the teacher, that's to the principal. And it really strains the relationship at times of teachers who have otherwise a very positive relationship with parents. Parents arrive in your classroom and they're angry about things that have nothing to do with the teacher or the performance of their duties. They're upset with the system. But the teacher becomes the face of the system, and you have conflict introduced because now nobody knows who to call or where to get answers from. And when you can't get answers, you come knock on the door of the teacher and you give them a hard time. So parents really have a lot more research to do. There's a lot more futile tail chasing in the initial stages of trying to problem solve. And together, teachers and parents are really bearing far more of the work of problem solving systemic concerns than they did under elected school boards. I do want to correct one thing that Patrick did say. Bill 72 did not create school advisory councils. They pre-existed Bill 72. So they used to exist as a structure at a local school level under the umbrella of elected school boards. Once they eliminated elected school boards, they basically promised that these groups would sort of replace the function in terms of parent advocacy, parent input on policy, and school governance. That they would get a budget, they would be enhanced, and ultimately none of those things have come to pass. But nonetheless, there's a greater pressure on parent volunteers in terms of the scope of practice for parents involved at the local school level has gone from being reasonable to being completely unmanageable, because now they have to be system experts about everything all the way to the upper levels of the Department of Education. And that's simply not something that you can reasonably expect of somebody who shows up to a meeting 6 times a year at their local school. The last thing I'll highlight is the lie that this reform will result in a significant cost savings. And really the myth is, well, if we reform governance, if we reform administration, we're going to reduce costs. And that means that we're going to have more of the money that we're spending out of the budget that can go back into the classroom. We're going to reinvest savings into frontline resources and supports for students and teachers. And the fact of the matter is that didn't happen. So to highlight this, when they effectively told elected trustees they weren't going to have jobs anymore, they didn't fire them on the spot. They basically paid them to sit at home for the remainder of their elected terms. In Nova Scotia, elected trustees were elected at the same time as municipal politicians, mayors, and council people. So there was a remainder of their term, and they paid them out to sit at home and not do the job. Then what they did is they took the money that would have been an equivalent amount of money effectively, if all of the salaries for all the elected trustees across the province, and they decided that they were going to give that money in small parcels to each and every school advisory council. So at a base rate, every school was going to get a budget of $5,000 plus an extra dollar per student over 500. And magically, this is going to make school advisory councils able to tackle systemic issues at the school level. And I think anybody on the call can probably appreciate that $5,500 to address systemic issues in a school of any size is a drop in the bucket. It's not going to get you very far at all. And what we've seen is that $5,000, there's no real criteria for what you can spend it on. Even though it says that there's criteria, they're very loosey-goosey, and we've seen some schools spend them on field trips and guest speakers. We've seen some schools spend them on fun fairs for students and guest speakers, and we've seen some schools spend that money on brand spanking new school uniforms and sports equipment. So it's really all over the place in terms of what this money got spent on, but really it's not going into classrooms. And that's what we were told would happen. So I could talk at length about a lot of other things, but I think those are the three things I'll highlight and turn it over to whoever is going to speak next, either Blair or Ben. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Paul. We will welcome Blair Frost to speak next and bring the perspective of a parent to our panel.